My name is Ethan Carter, and I'm 25. I live in Maple Hollow, a small town nestled in the heart of North Carolina. I work as a landscaper and pruner. It's not a glamorous job, but I like the feeling of using my hands to make order out of tangled grass. My life was simple. Until that afternoon. The sun was about to set when I parked my truck and headed back. My sleeves were damp with sweat, and I was planning on fixing a kitchen cabinet door that had been off its hinges since last week. But when I rummaged through my toolbox, I realized I was missing a large cross screwdriver, the only thing I needed to get the job done. I thought of the house across the street. Celeste Evans lived there, a tall, beautiful, reserved woman with neat brown hair and straight shoulders. She was older than me, I guess, maybe in her 40s, but she kept her house, her yard, and herself in near-perfect condition. Every time I saw her from afar, the image always made me think of the word, controlling, the kind of person who wouldn't let anything fall out of order. We were only acquaintances, a few greetings when we passed each other at the post office. A few pleasantries on Thanksgiving. I had never set foot in her house. But today, I needed a screwdriver. I crossed the street and walked up the front steps. The porch light had been on since early in the morning, casting a pale yellow light. I knocked 3 times. There was no answer. I was about to turn around when the door opened, slowly and heavily, as if it were fighting against itself. Celeste stood there, and I stopped short. She was no longer the neat woman she usually was. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup smudged around her eyes. Her loose cardigan covered her torso. Her shirt unbuttoned a few times, the hand holding the glass of red wine, almost empty. "Ethan," she said, her voice hoarse, as if she had just cried or screamed. Her eyes were fixed on me, momentarily confused, momentarily lost in reality. "Excuse me, I just wanted to borrow a screwdriver," I stammered, feeling clumsy at the wrong time. "Look in the tool cabinet under the stairs," she interrupted, then turned away. Not waiting for me to answer. I stepped inside, closing the door behind me. The inside of the house was a different world. Gone was the scent of bergamot essential oil that I had smelled whenever I passed by. Gone was the perfect order. The floor was strewn with tissues. The sofa was out of place. Pillows on the floor. A silver-framed photograph lay face down on the table next to a wilted vase of flowers. The living room light was dim as if it were about to go out. I paused in the middle of the passage, unsure whether to look for a real screwdriver or just make a peaceful retreat. Celeste sat down on the sofa, leaning back as if exhausted. The empty glass in her hand fell to the carpet without breaking, it just rolled and stopped. "I just kicked Darren out," she said, not looking at me. Her voice was flat, almost emotionless. I stood still. I had heard the name before, her husband. The man who often came home late and never smiled next to his wife in the pictures hanging in the hallway. "So, are you okay?" I asked. A stupid question, I knew. She laughed. It was half sarcastic, half broken. "Okay? No, Ethan, I'm not okay. But if I said I was okay, would anyone believe me?" She looked up at me for the first time. Those eyes, red, swollen, but still intelligent, looked straight at me, demanding confirmation. I didn't know what to say. Instead, I just nodded. "Can you sit for a moment?" she asked. Her voice was low, like someone trying not to drift away from herself. I walked over and sat on the edge of the sofa, a little distance from her. No one spoke for a long moment. The living room fell silent. The clock on the wall ticked, reminding them both that time was still passing, even though everything else seemed to stand still. Celeste sighed, pulling her knees up to her chest, hugging herself. Her cardigan slipped off her shoulders, revealing her slender collarbones and her skin, slightly flushed from the wine. I tried not to look, but it wasn't easy. "Do you know," she said, her voice flat, "I've lived 15 years with someone I couldn't trust?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. The question was just a way for her to get off something that was weighing on her chest. I knew he was cheating from the first year. But I stayed. I told myself things would be different. Every time he cried and promised to change, I believed him. Or, I tried to believe him. Maybe because I was afraid of being alone. Maybe because I thought, at this age, no one would choose me anymore. She looked at me, this time, The look wasn't trembling, it was direct. Almost challenging. I felt my heart constrict. Not because of what she said, but because of that look. Both the desire to touch something real and the fear that it would vanish if I got too close. She stood up. I stood up, too. Instinctively. I came to borrow a screwdriver, she said. She walked toward the hallway. Slowly, as if testing her courage. Then she stopped, looking back. Can you come in? The question came out lightly, but it carried an indescribable weight. I wasn't sure what I was thinking. I just followed. The bedroom was filled with a soft orange light from the bedside lamp. It was quiet, nothing different except for my pounding heart. Celeste stood in the middle of the room, her back turned. Then, very slowly, she reached up to unbutton the first button of her blouse. I swallowed. I took a step back. Celeste, stop. She stood still. Another button undone. I stepped forward. Gently, I put my hand on her shoulder. Please, stop, I said again, this time almost in a whisper. She paused. Her whole body was shaking. I could feel it in my palm. I don't want this, I said, pulling my hand away. Not when you're in pain. Not when everything's so messed up. She turned around. Tears were streaming down her cheeks. She didn't try to hide them. I just don't want to feel invisible another night, she choked out. I took my jacket and gently draped it over her shoulders. You're not invisible, I said. She started to cry, silently, not resentfully, just tears. I stepped back, my eyes still on her as if to convey something certain and real. Then I turned and walked out of the room. Before closing the door, I paused. I'll come back, if you want me to. But not tonight. I left that house, the cold wind blowing through my collar as if to pull me back to reality. On the way back, I felt no regret. I just felt my heart heavy as if I had just carried someone else's nameless sadness. I knew one thing for sure, Celeste was sinking. But not everyone needed to be pulled up immediately. Sometimes, people just need someone to stand there, ready to wait when they decide to rise. I will wait. 3 days later, I still hadn't seen Celeste come out of the house. No car pulling out of the driveway. No Marley barking good morning as usual. The front fence was still neat, but the daisies planted along the path were starting to bend in the sun. For someone like her, who kept things tidy out of habit, it was a sure sign that a storm was brewing inside. I didn't knock. Instead, I left a small pot of lavender on the porch. No name, no label, just something alive, fragrant, and in need of care, like her. The next morning, the pot was gone. That afternoon, as I finished mowing the last lawn in the neighborhood and the truck pulled up in front of the house, I saw Celeste standing on the porch. Marley was in her arms, sunglasses on, a long-sleeved cream shirt covering her entire body, despite the heat. She glanced at me, then turned back. That night, a text message quietly appeared on my phone. Unknown number. Thanks for the flowers. I assume it was you. I read it 4 times before replying. Me. No one else in this neighborhood would choose lavender. A moment later, just one more message appeared. Her. If you have time, come by for coffee tomorrow. I arrived on time 9 a.m. Not late, not early, just enough to not make her feel visited, but not to be seen as declining the invitation. She opened the door, this time without makeup, her hair tied back, and wearing a loose sweater and simple jeans. She looked a little tired, but her face was much calmer. Marley jumped out to greet me as if I were a new member of the family. Come in, she said, the coffee is just made. I walked in. The house was tidy again. No papers had fallen. No wine glasses were lying around. The scent of lavender was in the air. It was as if she was trying to clean up her own mess by cleaning everything outside. We sat at the small kitchen table. There were 2 cups of coffee and a plate of gingerbread cookies. She didn't say anything for the first few minutes, and I didn't try to fill the void. You didn't tell anyone about that day, did you? She asked, looking into her coffee. I'm not the type to talk about embarrassing things, I said, without hesitation. Celeste nodded. It wasn't a thank you, but an acknowledgement. Marley misses you, she said, and then smiled, the first time I'd seen her smile without strain. I'm not sure. I miss the flower pot. I said. She laughed, this time with a sound. Light, short, but true. And somehow, the distance between us, in just a few sentences, had shortened a little. After that light laugh, the atmosphere in the kitchen became easier to breathe. Celeste poured more coffee for both of them. Her hands were still shaking, but no longer nervous. She was no longer the woman who had crumbled in the bedroom light a few days before. But clearly, she was still learning to stand on her own 2 feet. "How old are you?" she asked. 25, I said. "And you?" She raised an eyebrow. "You?" I chuckled. "Sorry, Celeste." 42, she said, staring at me as if waiting for some response. I just nodded. "You're 17 years older than me. But I bet I'm better at counting plants in the garden." She laughed again, longer this time, and then her eyes softened a little. "I used to have a better garden than this," she said, "before things got complicated." "Want to do it again?" I asked, leaning back in my chair. "I have time, and I know what fertilizer works best for lavender." She didn't answer right away, but I saw her shoulders drop, lighten, as if she'd just taken off a layer of armor. The morning stretched into nearly 3 hours. We talked about seemingly unrelated things. Her least favorite cookie was oatmeal raisin cookies. And how I'd once eaten a grass garland at a picnic and had my ex-girlfriend laugh at me for 2 weeks. She told me about the first time Marley had run away from home after seeing a squirrel, and how Darren hadn't bothered to look for it. I told her about the neighbor's cat who'd climbed into my bedroom like he owned the house. These little stories, so insignificant, so seemingly, set the stage for something more peaceful than silence. When I got up to say goodbye, Celeste walked me to the door. She didn't hold my hand, didn't ask when we'd see each other again, just said, "If you have time, my backyard really needs a helping hand." I simply replied, "I'll come Saturday morning with gloves and pruning shears." She nodded. Her eyes met mine briefly. Then she turned away. I walked down the steps, not looking back, but I knew in my heart, today was the first day we'd truly touched each other's worlds. Saturday morning, I arrived with gloves, pruning shears, a bag of compost, and no expectations. Celeste was waiting on the back porch, her old shirt sleeves rolled up, her hair tied back, and Marley sunned himself near the steps like a lazy lion. Her backyard was larger than I'd expected. The soil was rich but weeds had crept in, obscuring the old borders. I saw the remains of climbing roses that had once been led up the trellis. White ceramic pots upside down on the ground, and a rotting wooden swing in a hidden corner. "It used to be beautiful," she said, standing next to me, her voice a little embarrassed and wistful. "I have no doubt," I said, "and it will be beautiful again. We just need to get started." She didn't just stand there and watch. Celeste picked up the shovel and hoe. And though she fumbled a few times, especially when Marley tried to grab my glove to play with, she didn't complain. Every time she raised her hand to wipe her forehead, I could see the faint tan lines on her arms, a sign of someone who had loved working outdoors. We didn't talk much as we worked. The sound of the shovel hitting the ground, the scissors cutting through dry branches, and Marley's steady breathing were enough. But every now and then, she would drop a sentence, short and honest. "Darren used to hate getting his hands dirty," she said as she filled the new lavender roots with soil. "He preferred to buy plants that were already planted and leave them to someone else to tend." "What about you?" I asked. "I like to start from seed," she replied, smiling. As the sun rose, we stopped to rest. Celeste brought out 2 glasses of cold lemonade and a plate of sliced apples. We sat on the porch steps, looking at the newly dug dirt before us. "I never thought I'd dig this garden again," she said, her gaze distant. "It used to be a place where I felt at peace, until it became something I wanted to avoid looking at." "Too, but you looked again today," I said. She turned to look at me. There was something in her eyes, not gratitude, not confusion, maybe recognition. "You always say things so softly that they're unforgettable," she said, and picked up her glass of water, clinking it lightly against mine in a wordless thank you. The day didn't end in the garden. As the sun set, we moved on to weeding the hedge, and as I turned to leave, Celeste called after me, "Ethan." I turned. She wiped her hands on a kitchen towel and stepped closer, taking my arm lightly. Can you come by tomorrow afternoon? There's a corner I'm not sure what to plant. I nodded. Do you have any ideas? Not really, she said, but I think I'd like to hear your suggestions. For the first time, she acknowledged a void, not to be filled, but to allow someone else to enter. The next afternoon, I returned as promised. Celeste greeted me with a small smile, no longer as reserved as before. She wore a simple, comfortable, knee-length cotton dress that revealed a few scrapes on her legs from the day before when she had stepped on a sharp rock. I had brought a tray of seedlings, a few purple asters, some ivy, and 2 fragrant rosemary sprigs. They're not the prettiest, I said as she examined the tray, but they know how to last. The kind of people I need, she replied, then paused as if she had said something wrong, but I just smiled. We spent the afternoon finishing the corner of the yard she hadn't decided what to plant. While I dug a drainage ditch, Celeste sat pruning the roots, occasionally looking up to ask unexpected questions. Ethan, are you afraid of failure? I raised my head, wiping the sweat from my forehead. I think I was more afraid of not trying than of failing. She paused for a moment, then nodded. I used to be very afraid. Afraid of breaking what seemed right. Afraid that people would look at me and see that I wasn't as perfect as I pretended to be. What about now? She looked at me, a small smile in her eyes. Now I'm planting flowers again, and having coffee with a boy 17 years younger than me. I laughed. Sounds like a calculated rebellion. She tilted her head. Maybe that's what I need right now. As the sun set behind the trees behind the house, she and I sat on the steps once more. Marley snored softly at our feet. The newly planted rosemary bushes gave off a sweet scent in the afternoon breeze. Celeste told me about her mother, a strong woman, who had once told her, when you feel yourself falling, dig a hole, plant something, and watch it grow. I never understood her until recently, she said, looking at the bare rose trellis. Now I think, maybe not everyone who comes into your life is meant to stay. But if they give you the courage to plant again, that's enough. I was silent. The words hit me in an unexpected way. Celeste turned, her eyes no longer fearful as they had been that first day. Not quite trusting, but ready. Ethan, she said softly, you helped me breathe again without trying to be strong. I didn't know how to respond. I just leaned in, letting my shoulder brush hers. We sat like that until the night began to fall. No words, no promises, just 2 people, a garden reborn, and a bond growing, quietly but firmly, like the first plant replanted after a stormy season. After that last afternoon in the garden, Celeste and I began to have our own rhythm, unhurried, unnamed. She would leave a glass of iced tea on my front steps at noon, along with a note scribbled with something like, "Don't overwater the lavender." I would often come over to her porch in the late afternoon, carrying 2 iced coffees or a bag of gingerbread cookies, which she liked. We didn't schedule appointments, nor did we call them meetings. It was as if it had always been a part of life, like Marley waiting by the fence, like the steady sound of pruning shears every afternoon. One Friday evening, I sat with Celeste on her porch chair. There was a breeze, the scent of rosemary wafted from the backyard, and fireflies were beginning to flicker in the shade of the trees. "What do you usually do on the weekends?" she asked, turning her teacup in her hand. "I mow Mrs. Jenkins's lawn. Then I go to the service station to fix the tiller. At night, I sit and read old books, listen to sad indie music. I laugh. What about you?" "I used to go to the farmer's market on Saturday mornings, have waffles with Darren, and then come home and watch Netflix. Now, I still eat waffles, but only a little." She smiles, but her eyes are a little blank. "You could ask me to join you," I blurt out, then realize I'm telling the truth. Celeste tilts her head, as if considering something. "I think, I'm still learning how to sit alone without feeling empty." I nod. "I understand. I lost the person I was going to marry 6 months before the wedding." She walked out. It's the first time I've said that to Celeste. She's quiet for a long moment. Then softly, "Are you okay?" "I think so," I say, looking out at the trees ahead. Not because I forgot her, but because I learned not to blame myself. In that moment, in the dim yellow of the porch light and the gentle breeze, something shifted between us. Something that needed no name. No promise, but was as clear as the scent of lavender on the wind. Celeste leaned back in her chair, then turned to face me. "Do you think everything happens for a reason?" she asked. "I'm not sure, but I think, sometimes, bad things happen to make way for something better that we're not ready for." She laughed. "That sounds like a line from an indie movie. Maybe I'm the lead." I winked. For the first time, she laughed out loud, and I realized I wanted to make her laugh like that, forever. That evening, I got home later than usual. When I crossed the street, Celeste was still standing on the porch, holding a glass of cold tea. Her eyes followed me as if she wanted to say something, but she didn't call out, and I didn't ask. There are silences that shouldn't be filled. I lay in bed, eyes wide open, not because of the coffee, because I was starting to get scared, afraid that I was falling into something too fast, even though it seemed slow on the surface. But then I thought again, maybe true feelings aren't measured by time, but by how peaceful you feel when you're with someone. The next day, Celeste invited me to lunch. "Just a sandwich," she said over the phone. "And don't mind if I make the chicken drier than desert." I brought a bag of cherry tomatoes, a culinary lifesaver. But the meal was simple and surprisingly perfect. We ate at the wooden table in the garden, which was now covered with blooming flowers and new potted plants. As we finished washing the dishes, a light rain suddenly began to fall. Instead of rushing inside, Celeste stepped out onto the porch, holding out her arms to catch the raindrops. Her hair was starting to get wet, sticking to her forehead. She turned to look at me, half joking, half defiant. "Do you dare?" I didn't answer. I just stepped out, letting the rain hit my shoulders and the smell of wet earth soak into my bare feet. We stood there, in the rain, laughing like children who had broken the rules. The wind blew leaves around the yard. Marley ran in circles, chasing her own shadow. When she turned to me, her eyes were as bright as ever. And I wanted to kiss her. Not out of impulse, not out of desire, but because that was her most beautiful moment, free, unguarded, unfettered. I took a step forward, my eyes never leaving her. She didn't back away, but when the distance was only inches, Celeste tilted her head slightly, whispering, "Not now." I paused, nodded. "I just need to know you're here," she said, using the pronoun I, for the first time when speaking to me. I said nothing, just stood there, in the misty rain, letting my heart silently join the sound of the rain, her breathing, and something that was growing between us, slowly but surely. I'd been thinking about it for almost a week. Should I do it? Was it too soon? Would it scare her? But then I wondered, if not now, when? On Friday afternoon, I pulled up in front of Celeste's house and stepped onto the porch with a thin envelope in my hand. My hands were shaking a little, not from nervousness, but because I knew I was treading on sensitive territory, inviting someone who was learning to trust again, to go away from it all. She opened the door in a pale blue shirt, her hands still covered in dirt. "Hello, gardener," she said, smiling. "New plants?" "Better than plants," I said, holding up the envelope. She frowned, opening the envelope as she sat down on the sofa. Her eyes scanned the plane ticket, then stopped at the bold print, Palm Springs, departing Sunday, 8 a.m. "Ethan, what's this?" she asked. But her voice was low. "Just an idea," I said, sitting down across from her. "A week in the sun, with a pool, no heavy memories, no pressure, no plans, just a break. With you?" she asked, her eyebrows furrowing slightly. "With me," I nodded, "but if you want to go alone, I'll keep that ticket for you." She looked at me for a long time, long and silent, as if she were asking if I was serious. "I don't know," she whispered. "I've never done anything like this. Never left anything behind. I've never asked a woman older than me to elope," I said, half joking, half serious. She laughed, briefly, but true. Then she looked back at the ticket. Her eyes slid to the name, Celeste Evans. And after a moment of silence, she let out a long breath, like someone had just unscrewed a cork that had been screwed on too tight for years. "Fuck," she said. "Okay, I'll go." The flight left Asheville early in the morning. On the plane, we sat next to each other but didn't say much. Not because we were unfamiliar, but because there were some things that didn't need to be filled with words. When the plane landed in Palm Springs, The sun was pouring gold across the distant mountains. The sky was a cloudless blue. Celeste stepped out of the airport and took a deep breath, as if her lungs had never been exposed to this air before. "It feels like a weird dream," she said. "It's better than a dream with waffles," I said. She laughed. "Remember those?" "Nothing you shared." She said nothing, but the look she gave me when she turned to me was enough to tell me she'd heard and understood. We rented a small room at a quiet resort. There was a pool, sun loungers, and palm trees that swayed as if whispering in the wind. Every morning, we walked the nearby trail, where the desert hugged the foot of the mountains. Wildflowers blooming on both sides. Celeste wore sneakers and tied her hair back. And for the first time I saw her laugh out loud when a desert squirrel jumped onto my hat. She laughed, not defensively, not worried that anyone was watching. And I realized the woman was alive again. One afternoon, we sat on the resort's porch, looking out at the empty pool. Celeste rested her chin on her hand, her eyes dreamy. "I thought I was going to grow old with Darren," she said, not sadly, just as if she were telling an old story. "I know," I said, and then I thought, I'd never love anyone again. I turned to look at her. "What now?" She didn't answer, just said softly, "I think I was wrong." That evening, we dined under the string lights hanging in the middle of the restaurant's courtyard. Celeste wore a simple white dress, her hair loose, and she looked as if 42 wasn't a number, it was a symphony of experience and freedom. I didn't take my eyes off her the entire time. She caught my eye a few times, and instead of avoiding it, she held it, softly, meaningfully. When we returned to our room, she put her keys on the table, then turned to look at me. "Can you stay?" Her voice was calm, not shaky, not desperate like the first time. I stepped forward, I put my hand on her cheek, and for the first time, our lips met. There was no rush, just the right moment, the right person, the right feeling. The next morning, I woke up while she was still sleeping, her back to me, the blanket loosely wrapped around her. The morning sun shone on her shoulders, shining like a light only for those who have walked through the darkness. I didn't touch her, I just lay there, watching her breathe evenly, and I knew I loved her. We returned to the room after dinner, neither of us saying much, but the atmosphere was different. No more wariness, no more hesitation like before. Every step, every eye contact carried a quiet acknowledgement. We had crossed over to the other side of the familiar. Celeste took off her shoes, put her purse on the table, then turned to look at me. We stood facing each other. In the tiny space of the resort room, the air conditioner hummed. Outside the window the palm trees swayed in the night wind. No invitation, no need for questions. I walked over, very slowly. She didn't retreat, didn't advance, she just looked at me, straight and deep, as if to check if I was serious. I reached up, touched her cheek lightly, then slid my hand to the back of her neck. She closed her eyes, her breathing quickened, and when I leaned down, my lips touched hers, not with impulsive passion, but with all the gentleness I could muster in a touch. The kiss was unhurried, it was like a whisper, "You don't have to fight anymore. I'm here." We moved into each other as if we had been there all along, just not daring to knock. As I unbuttoned her shirt, my hands shook slightly, not with lust, but with emotion. Each layer of fabric that fell was a piece of the past shed. The invisible scars, the fear of being touched, the memories of being taken advantage of, slowly receded. She stood there, unprotected, both in body and soul. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice very soft. "Sure about what?" I asked again. "About choosing me." I stepped forward, holding her close. "I'm not broken, you're just hurt, but you're still standing here. Still beautiful, still real." I felt her body soften in my arms, as if she had finally allowed herself to lean on someone without fear of being pushed away. We made love slowly. It was unlike any other night I'd ever had. Not a fiery night of desire, but a journey of trust. Every touch, every breath carried a question. "Are you okay?" And every time Celeste held me tighter, responding with her body and her eyes, I knew the answer was, yes. This time, I choose. She whispered my name in the middle of the night, in a soft moan, as if calling out to something sacred that she didn't dare believe was real. I whispered her name back, not as a man calls a woman, but as someone confirming that she had found what she had been searching for. We lay side by side in the dark, neither of us speaking. The hum of the air conditioner was like the steady breathing of the room. On the other side of the glass door, the streetlights reflected the palm branches swaying in the night wind. Celeste rested her head on my chest, her fingers tracing light circles on my skin, slow, steady, aimless, just a way to touch without letting go. For the first time in years, she said softly, "I don't feel like I have to force myself to be loved." I said nothing. I just tightened my arms around her, and in spoken acknowledgement. "Ethan," she whispered afterward, "you're unlike anyone I've ever met. Good or bad?" "So good that it scares me." She said it more honestly than I'd ever heard her say. I tilted my head slightly, kissing the tangled hair that smelled of shampoo. "You can be scared," I said, "as long as you don't disappear." She smiled. I could feel it in the slight movement of her cheekbone against mine. We woke up as the sun was just touching the blinds. Neither of us rushed to get up. Neither of us pretended the night had never happened. She sat up first, wrapping the blanket around herself as was her old habit. But when she turned to look at me, her eyes were no longer defensive. Just a small smile, warm and a little embarrassed. "Your hair is a mess." "A crow's nest is nice," I said, "as long as there are real birds in it." She shook her head, smiled, and got up to go into the bathroom. And when the door closed behind her, I could still hear her giggling through the wood. It was a sound I knew I would remember forever. That morning, we ate breakfast in the resort's backyard, a place with white umbrellas, wooden tables, and blooming cacti over hot coffee. Celeste wore an earthy maxi dress, the sunlight highlighting her tanned skin and the smile that was always on her lips. She looked free, not pretending to be okay, but the lightness of someone who had just unloaded a burden that had been weighing her down for years. "You know," she said, stirring her spoon in her coffee, "I thought I'd never want to sleep next to anyone again. Not because of sex, because of the feeling of being seen. And now?" She looked straight at me. "Now, I think if I were you, I wouldn't have to hide it anymore." The day passed in a series of leisurely strolls. We stopped by a used bookstore, bought a miniature cactus she named Frankie, and took pictures by the bougainvillea wall. No one mentioned last night, but there was no need. The way Celeste held my hand as we crossed the street, the way she leaned her head on my shoulder in the car ride back to the resort, the way she laughed when I accidentally spilled my drink, all of it made one thing clear. Last night wasn't a random moment. It was a starting point. We returned to Maple Hollow on a Monday morning. The air was calm, the clouds drifting slowly as if they were trying to prolong the holiday. No one spoke much in the car, but the silence was no longer distance. It was the peace of two people who had just stepped out of a new chapter and were opening the next one together. Marley barked loudly as we entered the yard. He jumped up, scratching my leg as if to reproach me. "Why haven't you been home for so long?" Celeste laughed loudly, kneeling down to hug the golden retriever to her chest. I stood still for a moment, looking at them, and feeling home. The space was familiar but not the same as before. Celeste's house suddenly had a new color, not because of repainting or additional decoration, but because for the first time I entered it as someone who was staying, not just someone who happened to pass by. The following days passed in a peaceful rhythm. I still go to work, mowing the lawn, watering the plants, adjusting the irrigation system for a lakeside villa. But every afternoon, I stop by her house. Sometimes just to drop off a cool cup of tea. Sometimes to water the garden together. Some days, I come for no reason at all, and that's fine. Celeste is different. She spends more time writing, reorganizing old drawers, clearing out things that have been there for too long. One day I saw her sitting on the porch, tearing pages from an old diary and tossing them into the wind. I didn't ask, I just sat next to her, silently with her. She smiled more, and more importantly, she smiled without apologizing for being happy. One Wednesday night, we sat on the porch. Marley stretched out at her feet, the breeze carrying the scent of the newly blooming roses. Celeste held a cup of hot tea, turning the porcelain cup as if considering something. I thought, after Palm Springs, I would come back and find things older, she said, but no, I felt lighter. Because of change, I said, or because you brought me out of my self-imposed confinement, she said, turning to look at me. I didn't argue, but I didn't take credit either. I just stood outside and waited. I said, you opened the door. That night, before I left, she handed me a small cardboard box. I opened it. Inside was a white ceramic mug. Printed on the side, "Best neighbor ever." I laughed. A reminder that you're still just a neighbor? I joked. A thank you for not running away, she said, her voice softer than any evening I'd ever heard it. I looked into her eyes. And for the first time since I'd been back, I found it no longer guarded but an open door. Wide and real. Since receiving the white mug with the words, "Best neighbor ever," I began to notice small changes around me. Celeste no longer turned on the porch light every night because she was afraid of the dark. She lit candles. She listened to jazz, which she had once called loud and funny, but now played every afternoon on the kitchen speakers. And most notably, she began calling my name more often, no longer the distant gardener or Ethan, but Ethan, as lightly as if it had been there all along. One Sunday morning, I brought her some homegrown tomatoes and a bag of warm bagels. As I walked up the steps, Marley ran out, and Celeste was standing in the doorway, no makeup, her hair loosely tied, but her eyes shining. "Are you really going to eat the bagels alone?" she asked. I held up the bag. You guessed right. We ate breakfast on the porch, our bare feet propped up on the arm of a chair, watching the sunlight filter through the trees in the front yard. She peeled a tomato with her fingers, then said suddenly, "Ethan, I don't know exactly where we are." I looked at her. "I don't want to name this too soon," she continued. "I don't want to make it into a new form that I have to try to fit into." I nodded. "You don't need a name. Just know that I want to see you every day." She paused. Then she smiled, bent down to take a bite of her bagel. How clever. I learned it from someone who lived in a shell for 15 years and was still sweet through it all. This time she didn't smile. She just gave me a long look that left me feeling naked. But not judged. Then she stood up and walked into the house. A minute later she returned, holding an old wedding ring box. She sat down next to me and opened the box. Inside was a dull silver wedding ring. "I kept it for so long," she said, "because I thought if I let it go, I'd failed." I said nothing. "But today, I think," she looked at me. "I didn't fail. I lived. I went through it." She closed the box and set it on the table. The closing didn't make a loud click, but in my heart, it was like closing the past. That evening, when I left the porch, Celeste didn't see me to the door like she usually did. She just took my hand and squeezed it gently. Then she said, "Ethan, I don't know where things are going, but if they're going to be with you, then I'm not afraid." I leaned down and kissed the back of her hand. "I don't need to know everything. Just know that you're not going anywhere." She nodded. Then I went back into the house and closed the door. Not locked, not slammed, just enough so the wind wouldn't blow out the candle burning on the table. And I stood there, on the steps, in that dim yellow light, feeling more clearly than ever. What we had didn't need a name, but it was definitely real. The afternoon was clear. The autumn sunlight slanted gently through the trees, reflecting off the still, mirror-like surface of the lake. The wind blew just enough to rustle the yellow leaves, to make Marley lazily lift his head from the grass, then curl up again to sleep. Celeste and I walked around the lake like any other afternoon. Her hands slipped into mine naturally, not shyly like the first time. Without invitation, like it had always been there. We sat down on the old wooden bench by the lake, the place that had witnessed the first silences, the cautious smiles, and the incomplete stories. I knew I was prepared. Not with a speech, not with roses or romantic music. Just a small ring box in my coat pocket, where I had left it since returning from Palm Springs, and carried it with me every time I was with her. Waiting for the right moment. Celeste took off her canvas slippers and propped her feet up on the bench. Her hand held the cup of tea she had brought from home. Her eyes looked out at the lake. "Ethan," she said after a moment of silence, "I thought I would grow old alone." I didn't reply. Sometimes the truest words need to be let go before they can be touched. It's not that I don't believe in love anymore, she continued. It's that I don't trust anyone enough to show them the worst parts of me. The parts that are hurt, or grumpy, or embarrassingly weak. I turned to look at her. You know what? I asked. I love all of that. She smiled, bowing her head slightly. You don't know who I used to be. I used to have everything under control. I used to have my life planned out, hour by hour, week by week, year by year. But with you, there's no plan, and that's where I feel safest. My heart felt heavy, not from worry, but from the ripening of my feelings. I exhaled, slowly, and reached into my pocket. Celeste. She turned. The sunlight fell on her hair at just the right moment, so bright that I almost squinted. I knelt. No preparation, no background music, just me and her, and the rhythm between us. I pulled out the small box and opened the lid. The ring was simple, white gold. No frills, but inside was engraved a single line. You are already enough. She looked at the ring, then at me. Her hand came up to cover her mouth. I said, almost in a whisper, I didn't come here to complete you. You are already enough, enough to hurt, enough to be strong, enough to be beautiful, in your own way. I came here because I wanted to be with someone who had overcome it all and still had the heart to love again. Tears welled up in the corners of her eyes. She didn't sob, just fall, softly and silently, like she had been holding back for years. Celeste, I said, my eyes never leaving hers. Will you marry me? She didn't answer right away. She sat there, her hands shaking slightly, her heart in her eyes. Then she smiled through her tears, and said softly, I thought the proposal would come from someone I had to fight to keep. But you came, and you never made me struggle. She held out her hand. Yes. I slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her. As if she had waited for this all her life. But only when she stopped looking did it come. She hugged me, tightly, not the hug of someone who is falling and needs to cling, but the hug of someone who has stood up, and chosen to walk with someone else. When we stood up, the sun was almost down. Marley ran over, jumping up as if he had heard the proposal himself. Celeste smiled and kissed me lightly on the forehead. You know, she whispered, I should have opened the door for you sooner. I squeezed her hand and said, no, you opened it just in time, when you were ready. And that made me want to come in all the more. We held hands and walked toward the house. Under the red sky at the end of the day. Each step was sure, not because we knew the future, but because we both chose to trust in the present. The afternoon was clear. The autumn sunlight slanted gently through the trees, reflecting off the still, mirror-like surface of the lake. The wind blew just enough to rustle the yellow leaves, to make Marley lazily lift his head from the grass, then curl up again to sleep. Celeste and I walked around the lake like any other afternoon. Her hands slipped into mine naturally, not shyly like the first time. Without invitation, like it had always been there. We sat down on the old wooden bench by the lake, the place that had witnessed the first silences, the cautious smiles, and the incomplete stories. I knew I was prepared. Not with a speech, not with roses or romantic music. Just a small ring box in my coat pocket, where I had left it since returning from Palm Springs, and carried it with me every time I was with her, waiting for the right moment. Celeste took off her canvas slippers and propped her feet up on the bench. Her hand held the cup of tea she had brought from home. Her eyes looked out at the lake. Ethan, she said after a moment of silence, I thought I would grow old alone. I didn't reply. Sometimes the truest words need to be let go before they can be touched. It's not that I don't believe in love anymore, she continued. It's that I don't trust anyone enough to show them the worst parts of me. The parts that are hurt, or grumpy, or embarrassingly weak. I turned to look at her. You know what? I asked. I love all of that. She smiled, bowing her head slightly. You don't know who I used to be. I used to have everything under control. I used to have my life planned out, hour by hour, week by week, year by year. But with you, there's no plan, and that's where I feel safest. My heart feels heavy, not from worry, but from the ripening of my feelings. I exhaled, slowly, and reached into my pocket. Celeste. She turned. The sunlight fell on her hair at just the right moment, so bright that I almost squinted. I knelt. No preparation, no background music, just me and her and the rhythm between us. I pulled out the small box and opened the lid. The ring was simple, white gold. No frills, but inside was engraved a single line. "You are already enough." She looked at the ring, then at me. Her hand came up to cover her mouth. I said, almost in a whisper, "I didn't come here to complete you. You are already enough, enough to hurt, enough to be strong, enough to be beautiful, in your own way. I came here because I wanted to be with someone who had overcome it all and still had the heart to love again." Tears welled up in the corners of her eyes. She didn't sob, just fall. Softly and silently, like she had been holding back for years. "Celeste," I said, my eyes never leaving hers, "will you marry me?" She didn't answer right away. She sat there, her hands shaking slightly, her heart in her eyes. Then she smiled through her tears, and said softly, "I thought the proposal would come from someone I had to fight to keep. But you came, and you never made me struggle." She held out her hand. "Yes." I slipped the ring onto her finger. It fits perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her. As if she had waited for this all her life. But only when she stopped looking did it come. She hugged me, tightly, not the hug of someone who is falling and needs to cling, but the hug of someone who has stood up, and chosen to walk with someone else. When we stood up, the sun was almost down. Marley ran over, jumping up as if he had heard the proposal himself. Celeste smiled and kissed me lightly on the forehead. "You know," she whined, "I should have opened the door for you sooner." I squeezed her hand and said, "No, you opened it just in time, when you were ready. And that made me want to come in all the more." We held hands and walked toward the house. Under the red sky at the end of the day. Each step was certain, not because we knew the future, but because we both chose to trust in the present. We started calling each other by different names. I called her home, and she called me Windkeeper because, as she once said, "I'm not forcing you to change. I'm just keeping you from being swept away." On rainy evenings, we'd lie on the sofa, Marley and Pepper between us like a feather pillow that could move. Celeste read. I listened to music or fixed something around the house. No one needed to talk constantly. Silence was no longer scary, it was part of the intimacy. One day I accidentally knocked over a jar of fish sauce in the kitchen. The smell was strong, all over the floor, and there was a mess of cleaning up. I thought she'd get mad. But Celeste just stood there, arms crossed, watching me mop the floor with her pink gloves, and then burst out laughing. "You married the right person," she said, "because no one else would dare to use this floral towel to mop up fish sauce." One day in mid-March, she and I walked to the old lake where the proposal had been made. It was chilly, but clear. The trees were still dormant, with only a few buds beginning to sprout. She looked at the water, then turned to me. "Ethan," I turned back, "I'm still not sure I know how to love properly. But one thing I'm sure of. Every morning when I wake up, I want to turn around and see you still there." I squeezed her hand. "And if I don't, you know I'm downstairs burning sandwiches. Right?" She laughed. I shrugged. "Probably." She leaned her head on my shoulder and whispered, "We're doing it right, right?" "I don't know. But if this is wrong, then I don't want to be right anymore." I don't know how to define what Celeste and I have. It didn't start with fire. It started with a door slightly open, a small flower pot, a refusal at the wrong moment, and a nod at the right moment. We weren't perfect. She was broken. I was scared. But every day, we chose to stay, not because we needed to, but because we wanted to. If someone asked me what love was, I wouldn't give a definition. I would just tell them about the afternoon by the lake, the old wooden chair, and the 42-year-old woman who thought she was past the age of being loved, but still agreed to hold my hand. 17 years younger than her. To continue walking together. And I would say, love doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be real, and enough to be called staying. Team Daily Unexpected Stories.